Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to ProMed's webinar, the event planning process for medical providers. My name's Matt Dinnery. I'm a qualified teacher who's completed MIMS training twice over, clinically a FREC 4, and I also have a degree in biomedical sciences. I've been working in the event sector as an event organizer, a crowd safety manager, security, medical coordinator, and various other roles since 2006. So I understand the process from quite a lot of different angles. I've also been involved in the production of various plans for medical provision, for crowd safety, and overall event safety management plans throughout my career so far. As many of you, I'm sure, are already aware, ProMed does provide these webinars free of charge. However, we do like to take the opportunity to let you know about some of the physical face-to-face training courses that we have coming up. So if you'd like to visit our website, which is promed999.co.uk/training, you'll be able to find out full details for all of these courses. Or if you're contemplating doing these courses, whether with us or another provider, do take a look at our website as it breaks down the qualifications in a very easy to understand way, so you know how you're going to be assessed, what you're going to need to learn, if there's any sort of pre-learning, pre-reading that you should be doing, and also what books will be useful during your course. So first of all, I'm sure many of you already hold the level 3 certificate in first response emergency care, but if you have any friends who would like to do the course, we're doing this for £325 plus VAT. We'll run these regularly every 6 to 8 weeks from our Aylesbury Training Centre. The next one is beginning on the 29th of August, although there is only a couple of places left. So if you'd like to book that, please do get in touch as soon as possible. On the 3rd of October, we'll be starting our next FREC 4. This is ran over 3 weekends. So you're in for a weekend, you're off for a weekend, you're in for a weekend, you're off for 3 weekends, you're back in for a weekend. That gives you plenty of time to do your workbooks, ask questions, and borrow the core textbooks to make sure you have the best possible chance of getting those questions right. £395 plus VAT. If you already hold your FREC 4 and you need to requalify on your immediate life support, which you do need to do every 12 months, we'll run those courses about every 8 weeks from our base in Aylesbury, or if there is 6 of you, we can come up to you anywhere in the country. It's £125 plus VAT. That's just a one-day course. And if you have your FREC 4 and you're working for a CQC registered provider, we can also do the Safe Administration of Life-Saving Medications course. That's £165 plus VAT. You get your JR Calc pocketbook. Our next course will be the 26th and 27th of September in Aylesbury. For those of you who've been here before, I'm sure you've seen our code of conduct, but for all of you new people, everybody attending ProMed training events have the right to expect a space free from bullying, intimidation and harassment. We expect you to treat everybody with dignity, respect and courtesy and not be discriminated against. Throughout these webinars, I'm sure you will have differing opinions. You might disagree with something I'm saying or what one of your colleagues is saying, and we absolutely encourage that disagreement and we encourage healthy debate, as long as everybody's respectful and listens to one another, shares their viewpoints. That's how we all learn from one another. So please do engage in that debate as we go through this evening. The chat box is available throughout. It is being monitored by ProMed admin team. Thank you very much for their help. They will be responding to any questions if possible, or giving me a nudge if there's something that I need to have a look at. Please do ask the questions as you go through, and if I don't answer them while we go through, I will recap them all during the question and answer session at the end. During the question and answer session, if you want to raise your hand, I will invite you to unmute yourself and we can have a conversation, some dialogue about your question, and that'll encourage some further shared learning and often introduces further conversations in the chat box. If you can't see where to raise your hand or other little prompts, just click participants at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a little panel come up and you'll have options such as yes, no, go slower, go faster, raise your hand, going for a break, not here, so on and so forth. If you're having any problems using Zoom, just send a private message to ProMed admin team and they'll be able to help you out. Okay, so tonight we're going to be looking at the event planning process overall, right from the very beginning, where we are quoting for our client. And that includes looking at how we would risk assess the event. We're going to look at the industry standard documents, which are the purple guide and the green guide. We're going to be looking at how to work with safety advisory groups or SAGs or SAGE or ESAG or various other names as they may be known. We're going to look at liaising with the local Ambulance Service NHS Trust and also the local acute NHS Trusts, i.e. the hospitals. We're going to look at the detailed planning we'll be going into with your client and the event production team, and we'll look at how to develop working relationships with our key safety stakeholders and who they are. So first of all, we'll be looking at quotations, and we're going to look at where we're going to start with that. So before we get there, I just want to ask a really quick question, see what people know so far, and that is, whose responsibility is it to propose a medical plan for an event? Is it the event organizer who should be proposing it to the medical provider, or is it the medical provider who should propose it to the event organizer? So you can see quite a few of you have already got started voting there. Let's see if we can get more than half of you voting. More you get stuck in, the more you're going to remember from this session. Welcome to those of you who've just started joining us. Okay, I can see 3/4 of you have joined us now, so that's excellent. Just going to end that polling there. What's really interesting is just over a third of you believe it's the event organizer's responsibility to propose a medical plan, and just under 2/3 of you believe it's the medical provider who should be producing the proposal. Interesting that that's quite split. The responsibility, according to the Purple Guide, is that it is the medical provider who should propose the medical plan in the first instance. It is the event organizer who is responsible for accepting that and whose decisions are ultimately the ones that will be questioned. But as the experienced professionals, as the experts, if you will, we're the ones who should propose that initial plan that starts the discussion and the debate with our client. So the questions that we should be asking, we need to be asking who. So what's the audience demographic? How many people are going to be attending? Are they young? Are they old? Do they like to take drugs? Do they like a drink? Are they likely to be moshing in front of a band? We want to know who the event production company is. What's their experience? Have they done similar events before? We want to know the numbers of staff, so how many contractors will be on site, how many security and stewards, how many caterers, for example, because this all influences the level of cover that we're going to need to provide. We want to know what, so what is actually happening. So from the moment our customers first arrive within the event footprint until after they leave the event footprint following the event, what takes place? What is the customer journey? What is going on in the background? We need to know where this is happening. So where is it located in the world? So we can work out what hospitals might be nearby, which Ambulance Service Trust it falls under. We also need a site map of the event. So where are things located in relation to each other? Where are they proposing that first aid post could go? Where are the roads that are already on site, for example? We also need to know when it's taken place. So is it day or night? What the dates are, what the times are, is there overnight camping? So this factors in if it's a summer or a winter event, then there are more extreme temperatures than if it's a spring or an autumn event. If it takes place over 4 or 5 days and it's got camping, then we need to make sure we've got 24-hour provision. If it's a 3-day event, but just during the day, then that also is going to make things a little bit cheaper because we're not setting up and de-rigging every day as long as they have overnight security, for example. We need to know why. So what is the purpose of the event? Why do people want to come to this event? What's drawing them to it? Is there a community purpose? Is this local authority funded? That might affect any stipulations and so on. And then we need to look at the how. So what risk assessments do we have in place? What control measures is the event organizer going to adopt? What does their event safety management plan say in terms of how they're going to deliver it? What does the crowd management plan say about audience movement and any pinch points? So once we've got all that information together at that quotation stage, we can then move on and conduct a risk assessment. And the risk assessment is going to start looking at the numbers expected. So an event for 200 people is very clearly going to have a different profile to an event with 2,000 or 20,000 people. And it's important that we get the numbers expected as well as the maximum licensed capacity, because if I've got an event that's got a maximum licensed capacity of 19,999, then we're going to make a proposal that is commensurate with that level. But actually, if our promoter is quite early into the event, that might be their 2nd or 3rd year, and they think they're only going to sell 10,000 tickets, then our proposal is actually going to reflect that number's there, but it's also going to demonstrate how we can increase the provision and what steps we would need to take in order to provide a safe level of clinical care for the numbers that we expect to be on site and that maximum. We're going to include the nature of the event. So a music festival with a young audience where there's alcohol and overnight camping involved is going to be very different to a one-day family fair where everybody turns up in families and there's going to be young children. So the nature of the event is one of the biggest determinations of the profile of skill mix that we would provide. So a large event with few risks might need a large number of first aiders to ensure there is a good level of cover everywhere. But a smaller event with a strong likelihood of people requiring medical attention is more likely to need lower numbers of staff, but those staff are going to need to be of a higher skill level, for example, not paramedics, not doctors, not nurses. We need to know the history of the event. So for all we can look at those two factors, if the event's ran before, if it's got a 3, 4, 5 year, 10 year, 20 year history, and the provider in the past has provided information as to what has happened in the past, or if it's our event in the past and we know what's happened at the event, then we'll be tailoring our risk assessment based on the reality of what's happened. I'll give you an example today. I took a phone call from a new client. They've run their event in the past. They've had different medical providers. It's very low risk. There is a maximum of 400 people on site. People are mostly seated. There's no kind of physical activity. However, a number of years ago, they did have an incident take place, a medical condition with a customer, and that resulted in a fatality when that person arrived in hospital. Now, that wouldn't come through the numbers expected and the nature of the event. However, that history has made me think, okay, I need to make sure that we are providing a suitable level of staff because that might happen again. We also want to know what the event organizer is doing in relation to safeguarding. So do they have a specific welfare provision? Do they have specific lost children's facilities? Are they already in contact with some health promotion services, for example? Is this event targeted at people who might be vulnerable? And does that in turn contact people who may seek to predate on them? If we know what safeguarding is already in place, we can make sure that our policies are aligned to that. But if there's no safeguarding in place, then we can discuss, depending on what our company offers, we might say, well, actually, we do have staff who are experienced at providing a welfare service. Would this be something you're interested in? Or we have staff who are experienced at dealing with lost children. We can provide that as an additional standalone service so that you just come to your one provider and we provide everything, although making sure, of course, that we treat that service very separately to those numbers and those requirements for a medical plan. If we know what safeguarding is in place, then we can be more assured that the event organisers taken their responsibility seriously. If, however, we ask that question and they go, what's safeguarding? Then for me, that increases the risk profile of an event because I'm not convinced that the event organizer is aware fully of all their legal obligations. And therefore, I might take a much deeper look into some other areas of their event to see what they've done for that, because ultimately my risk is kind of thinking a little bit higher than would otherwise be the case. I also want to know about the welfare facilities being provided and who is providing them. So if their welfare is being provided by a couple of volunteers working directly for them, I want to know who they are, what experience they've got. If they tell me their welfare is being provided by the Samaritans or by Loop or by one of the big well-known companies or voluntary organisations who have robust policies and procedures and are used to working with medical providers, I'll be absolutely happy. The reason I want to know who it's being provided by is if I'm successful at the quotation stage, one of the first few phone calls I'm going to be making is to that welfare provider because I want to draw up a memorandum of understanding. In the early days, I want to know how they're going to refer to us. I want to know how we're going to refer to them. Do they want us to be present nearby? Do they want us to be present in their service? Or are they happy just to call us and we'll trundle over in 5 minutes because they know when somebody's going to start to deteriorate and they're happy that if they tell us, they're telling us early enough. I also want to look very carefully at the event safety management plan, the site maps, perhaps the website, any news articles, anything I can find online really, I want to know what might cause injury or illness and whether that's severe weather, whether that's participation in extreme activities. Google Images is an absolute goldmine. If I type in the event name, if it's run before, I will generally see a whole range of information from news agencies and previous participants. I'll also type the event name into Twitter, and if the account has a Twitter account, then I will be able to search against that handle and see what people have been tagging them in, because again, you can find out a lot of information about the customer experience and how things are viewed from the customer eyes. And I can potentially spot hazards that might give rise to more injuries or more illness. And if I know that in advance, then I'm not going to be caught with my pants down when I eventually get there. And the other thing is the likelihood of high acuity presentations. Now, a high acuity presentation, if you've not heard that term before, is a patient who is going to require a higher level of clinical care from somebody with those registrations. So somebody who's going to need to be managed by a paramedic, by a doctor or by a nurse, who is likely to be in our care for a longer period of time, and possibly, depending on the nature of their injury or illness, may need to be transported off-site. Now, somebody who's had a drug overdose is a high acuity presentation because we need them to be monitored until we're sure the effects of their drugs have worn off. Somebody who is having an acute myocardial infarction is a high acuity presentation because they're going to need to be transported off-site for primary percutaneous coronary intervention. Likewise, on the opposite side of that, if there is a hazard that is causing people to trip over, that's not going to be a high acuity presentation, because if we can rule out a fracture, then they can be discharged with worsening advice, preferably going home in the care of a responsible adult. So knowing what type of injuries and illnesses we're going to get affects the level of care, the numbers of staff that we're going to need to provide. So just before we move on to the Purple Guide, I can just see a couple of questions coming in. First of all, from Alexander. Have we ever turned down a job or radically changed the anticipated quote due to concerns highlighted after further investigation? Paul and Ruth have both said yes, they have. Yes, I absolutely agree, Alexander. I have turned down jobs, either because the client doesn't wish to pay for the level of cover that I believe is necessary, and in which case we're more than happy not to provide that, because if they want to put their customers at risk and find themselves in court, ultimately that's on them. Do I want to be part of the witness lineup in court? No, I don't. So I'd rather turn that down, and I'll explain in my email very politely why I feel I don't think it's safe for my organisation to cover that event. In terms of have I radically changed the quote, for us that happens very rarely. It's not often we manage to produce our cover proposals, and I'll go into those shortly. It's not often I manage to produce those and issue a quote based on that without doing a very good level of due diligence. So we would do our online searches, we would search social media, news agencies, Google. We would do our background checks on Companies House and the directors of the company that we're working for. We would speak to our friends in the industry, because I also work in events generally. I have a lot of contacts in a lot of different sectors. So if I haven't heard of somebody, I generally know people who will have heard of them in it, or at least I know people in that sector, and I can ask some questions. Alarm bells for me tend to be nobody's heard of them, or if I look on Companies House and the director seems to have a list of companies attached to them, especially where Dissolved appears next to that list, that kind of makes me a bit cautious, and I tend to overquote. The way I look at it is, if I'm unsure of anything, I'd rather increase the amount of cover we're going to provide and quote on that increased basis, and have the organizer then justify themselves and explain why they don't need that amount of cover and provide appropriate evidence and documentation to that effect, and then go down to perhaps what it maybe should have been without my spidey senses tingling. I'm generally more likely to do that than I am to increase a quote, because I tend to go in stronger than I need to, because it's easier to justify changing it down when the event organizer has realized they're going to really need to reassure me and provide that evidence, because I've then got a lot of documentation to back up my decisions. So Moving on, I've just seen medics are cheaper than lawyers, absolutely 100%. So we're going to look at the Purple Guide. So for those of you who are familiar with the Purple Guide, you'll know that Chapter 5 is the medical chapter. What I'd like to know is, when do people think the Purple Guide was last updated, and who authored the Purple Guide? So if you're familiar with the document, have a vote. If you're unfamiliar with the document, have a guess. I'm going to mute myself and give you about 45 seconds to answer that question.
Matt, while people are answering that, can I ask you a question?
Privately, Pete, because when we're speaking, everyone can hear us.
Sorry?
2 seconds.
It's about the level of cover that you were talking about before.
Okay, I can see just under 2/3 of you have voted. So if you haven't voted, just have a guess, and we'll discuss why any of the answers are wrong, and we'll discuss why the remaining option is correct. So last few of you, just have a little go. Okay, so just going to end that there, and let's have a look. So Purple Guide, I can see a range of answers. The majority of people have gone for 2019. So let's start with the earliest year. So 1999 was the last edition of the Health and Safety Guide 195, which was known as the Event Safety Guide and colloquially became known as the Purple Guide. Following that, in 2014, the Health and Safety Executive decided that they were not the right people to produce the guide anymore and handed it over to another organisation. And in 2014, that was released. It was in March 2014 that the Purple Guide, which is available online, and admin team is going to provide the web link to that, became first available. This is a dynamic website, so it's updated fairly frequently, and the last time major updates were made to that was in November 2019, medical being one of the chapters that was updated. The second question is, who authored the Purple Guide? So I can see the majority of you went for the Health and Safety Executive. One person went for Sports Ground Safety Authority, and the remainder went for the Events Industry Forum. So as I alluded to just before, the Health and Safety Executive realised they weren't best placed to provide information on event safety overall, because it was a very small part of their work, whereas there are a lot of event safety professionals who were regularly working together at different events and who had much more detailed and recent experiences. And they came together to form the Events Industry Forum, who look after the Purple Guide and ensure that it's updated regularly. The Sports Ground Safety Authority were responsible for something else. Purple Guide doesn't come into play at events at sports grounds, but we'll look at that in a little bit more detail as we go through. So let's go through the Purple Guide. So Purple Guide says that every event should have a medical plan which is based on a comprehensive risk assessment. So the medical provider should carry out a full risk assessment of the event and propose an appropriate event medical plan. So those risk assessments should always drive internal planning, especially when you're planning for escalation type events. Now, an escalation event is where something is beyond our normal business as usual. It's where we might have surge capacity plans. It's where we might have major incident plans. It's where we might need to call in external assistance. And the important thing to remember in terms of our medical plan is that larger events may have thousands of pre and post site workers living and working on site. So the area is a place of work, and the health and safety regulations for working at height and hard hat zones therefore apply. So if you are covering a build in the break period, you would need to ensure that those medics are suitably trained in the PPE, are suitably trained in the procedures. If you have a lot of people working on stage, you might want to look at the risk assessment method statements for working at height. You might want to know what the working at height rescue plan is if somebody were to suffer illness or injury at height and couldn't self-extricate. It may be that your risk assessment includes that you need to provide safe working at height trained medics who are able to access that area, who've done an appropriate training course and have appropriate equipment to be able to access that height. So the medical plans should aim to provide a safe, effective and resilient service on site whilst helping to minimise the impact on NHS resources. What that means is every event should have an appropriate level of medical cover, and the key objectives are to be safe, effective and resilient and minimising the impact on the local NHS. So the local NHS isn't just the ambulance service, it includes the nearby hospitals, the nearby major trauma centres, burns units, it includes GP surgeries, it includes pharmacies, it includes walk-in centres and minor injuries units. Medical facilities should be designated, sited, equipped and staffed in accordance with the expected activity, and there should be additional capacity available for unexpected contingencies. So it's no good saying, okay, we've got a first aid post that can have 3 people on beds and 6 people who walk in, because that might cope with day to day. But if you're almost always at that capacity, if a sudden event takes place, you would then be impacting on NHS resources because you might need to call in for additional support. And that's not what you should be aiming for. As part of your medical plan, you need to ensure that you have reliable communications because they are key to effective working. And it's important that there should be a dedicated channel on the radio communications system for the sole use of medical services. The use of shared channels is not acceptable and may breach data protection regulations and other associated legislation. Now, there is a way around that if you are working on the short-term higher frequencies, and that is to use digital radio communications with a level of encryption, where the encryption key is only accessed from medical provider radios and is not programmed onto any other team radios. That would allow you to be compliant. However, in an ideal world, everybody would be on PMSE radio licenses. So for medical providers, if you don't know how your radios are set up, then you should be engaging a competent and appropriately licensed Ofcom licensed radio supplier who can advise you on the appropriate measures to take. Maybe you have a license that works nationwide for your organisation if you regularly operate across the country. It may be that you apply for PMSE licenses for specific events, which is often a cheaper alternative, and you just reprogram your radios regularly. You can keep the same encryption key across all of your channels. However, you would need to adjust the frequencies based on what Ofcom tell you to do. It's important to remember that in line with GDPR, records must be clear, interpretable and accurate. In terms of the Health and Social Care Act, we need to make sure that they are comprehensive and accurately record everything that we do with the patient. In terms of general events, good practice and what may happen further down the line, we need to make sure that we have decision logs, and everything we produce needs to be available as soon as reasonably practicable if requested by people such as the police, coroner's court or any inquiries. In any case, they need to be able to be produced within 24 hours of any escalation incident. We are duty bound by patients' privacy and confidentiality. However, in the case of children under the age of 18, child protection issues do take precedence over patient confidentiality. So we need to make sure that our medical plan explicitly states under what circumstances we would release any records and to whom we would share that information with. Generally speaking, event organisers don't have a right to any identifiable information, and therefore we need to be absolutely explicit in our medical plan that we would never provide that to an event organiser. However, we would provide specific information to the police upon request. We would provide specific information to the NHS Ambulance Service or to a hospital or any provider who is continuing care for that patient where it is in the patient's best interest and or where we have consent to do so. We should also say that we are going to provide aggregate information or information as to the nature of injuries sustained on site to the event organiser or the appointed event safety team in the interests of ensuring that no customers or members of the public come to any further harm. We are the people who will find out about what is injuring people. We are the people who are going to spot those likely trends before anybody else. So we need to ensure that we've got a mechanism in place for collating that information and provide an aggregate, non-identifiable information to those who are going to act on it and prevent people from coming to further harm. We will be working with welfare services in pursuit of a common goal. We are going to be safeguarding those who are vulnerable. That's not just children, and that's not just those who might be on a register of vulnerable adults, but that could be those who are temporarily vulnerable by way of what they've done at the event, for example, through intoxication, by alcohol or drugs, or anything else that's had an impact on them. They may be unconscious through any other means, and that would also render that person vulnerable at that moment in time, and we need to ensure that they're safeguarded, not only whilst they're in their care, but for the remainder of the event. In terms of our medical plan, events don't start when customers walk through the gate, and they don't end when the last performer finishes on stage, or when the last, whatever the entertainment was, or when the fairground stops. The event ends only when the last piece of equipment and the last member of staff leaves the site. So the egress of an audience of 10,000 on a night is likely to be a very different challenge for looking after 10,000 people in front of the main stage. So we need to include in our medical plan how we're going to manage the provision during the live phase of the event, but we also need to have a provision for the ingress phase and the egress phase. In particular, during the ingress phase, where there might be significant volumes of traffic coming into the event from a lot of different directions, how are we going to ensure that if we need to call for external help because we need to transport a patient off-site, how are we going to get that ambulance to us? And likewise, during the egress phase, we might have ambulances on site that are authorised for off-site transportation. How are we going to ensure that our ambulance is able to get off-site and onto the quickest route to the appropriate receiving hospital for that patient, bearing in mind there's going to be a significant number of vehicles exiting site from a lot of different places, trying to go in many different directions. We also need to ensure that we have a clear communications plan, and that's not just for on-site communication, but that's also between the NHS Ambulance Service and other off-site providers to ensure effective handover and coordination of any incidents that might take place. Event organisers need to exercise due diligence in selecting competent and reliable medical services, because I'm sure many of you are aware, whether you're a company owner or whether you're a medic or whether you're an event organiser, medical providers do vary in quality and capability, and we need to be wary about what people are calling themselves. We need to be wary of what they're calling an ambulance. We need to be wary of what they're calling their staff. So the likes of doctor, nurse, midwife, paramedic, biomedical scientist, physiotherapist, and so on are all regulated and restricted titles that you must be registered with an appropriate body in order to use those. However, things like emergency medical technician, first responder, emergency care assistant, ambulance care assistant, emergency care support worker, and so on are unrestricted titles, and so we need to be very clear what we are providing when we use those titles. If you have a look at your existing cover proposals, your existing medical plans, have a think. If an event organiser was to appropriately do their due diligence, how have you justified who you are and what you are? So as an example, when ProMed sends out its cover proposal, we detail the level of public and products liability insurance we have. We detail the level of medical indemnity insurance we have and who our provider is. So if anybody wants to ring up our broker or our insurer and say, is Professional Medical Ambulance Services Limited still insured with you? Are their premiums up to date? And do they really have £1 million worth of indemnity insurance? Then that information is there. We don't provide any phone numbers. They can just type those names into Google, obtain the details themselves, and that gives them that additional level of verification. We provide our registration number with Companies House, so people can just plug that straight in. It will return our full name, our registered address, who our directors are. It will provide the accounts which are up to date, so people can look at our financial due diligence if they want. It provides information as to our registration with the Information Commissioner's Office. It provides information as to our waste carrier licence and any other registration numbers that we have. We provide in our cover proposal so that event organisers, should they choose to exercise their right to do due diligence on us, are supported in doing that. We absolutely encourage event organisers to be duly diligent because we know that we've got nothing to hide. When we are told that there are quotes that are significantly below our quote, we say, okay, that's fine. You've seen all our registration numbers, you've seen all of our insurance provision. Please make sure you check them out and assure yourself that you're happy with who we are. And please make sure you do that with all of your other providers. The reliable event organisers, the ones who do care about their customer safety, will generally come back to us a week later and go, you're the only person that's freely provided all that information, even though we've asked the others, or we've had some from the others and we've checked it out and it turns out they're not quite what they're making themselves out to be. So we'd rather go with you because you provided all this information up front. We know you've got nothing to hide. We know that you're, putting everything on the table. So do have a look at that and do be very careful about that. Nick, sharing information for RID or reportable incidents. So RID or reportable incident, you can make that RID or report directly to the Health and Safety Executive, which is a legal obligation. So you don't need to provide any identifiable information to anybody other than who legally needs to have it. It may be that you have an agreement with the event organizer that in the event of a RID or reportable incident, you would immediately inform the safety officer who would attend that patient in person. So they would turn up to your first aid post. Your medical team would then explain to the patient that because of what's happened, it needs to be reported to the Health and Safety Executive. And here is Sally, who's the event safety officer. Do you mind if she comes in and asks you a few questions? And that way, you've then got consent for that person to speak to your patient, so you let them in. The patient then provides those details freely directly to the event organizer, so you've not breached any legislation because that information has been provided direct. Absolutely. And don't forget as well that near misses, so it's not just industrial diseases and dangerous occurrence and injuries that need to be reported. It is any near miss which could have gave rise to those that you must also report to the Health and Safety Executive. Now, the Purple Guide, the HSG 195 had an amazing table which had lots of numbers and it had a calculation and it gave you a score, and based on that score, it then gave you a recommendation. This has not been the case since 2014. The Purple Guide did away with that very, very prescriptive level of if your event scores this, you must have that. That was stopped. It is, in my personal opinion, frankly, embarrassing and shocking that there is at least one NHS Ambulance Service Trust, to my knowledge, which still demands from event medical providers and event organisers that an HSG 195 assessment is completed and submitted. And any deviation from that has to be justified to them. In my opinion, that shows that that particular service has not followed any evidence-based practice, is not keeping up to date with current practices, and it makes me wonder about what they're doing with their patients if they can't even manage to interact with professionals using current and up-to-date evidence. I will not disclose which trust that is. Some of you may already be aware if you've worked in their area, because you'll have had an event medical assurance form sent to you, which they also demand 60 days in advance. I'm sure many of you will have had phone calls 2 weeks or even less, and you work your absolute backside off getting everything in place. It's impossible to get that to them 60 days in advance because the event was only planned 6 weeks in advance. Simon, that might be the same trust. I can't remember where you're from. If you tell me privately, I might let you know. NARU plan used to be based on that. I believe that since the publication of the new Purple Guide, the NARU, when that next gets updated, is going to use the new guidance from my sources inside the National Ambulance Resilience Unit. It's not the one I was thinking of. I've not personally provided cover in your trust area, but thanks for letting me know about that. Yes, so that's now 2 trusts that still use that. So let's take a look at the table. So we need to know how many patient presentations they're going to be and what the expected level of acuity is. Now, these run from very low to very high. So this is relative. So the expected number of patient presentations out of your overall number of customers. So if you regularly run an annual event with 10,000 people and maybe every year 1 or 2 people come to the attention of medical services, that's very low. If on the other hand, you run an event for 10,000 people and say 70 of them are coming to your medical provider over the course of a day, that's either high or very high. Your expected levels of patient acuity is essentially based on the expected number of presentations. So if out of 100 people presenting to the medical provider over the course of a weekend, 2 of them require paramedic skills, I would say that's probably low. If 1 of them perhaps needed advanced skills, then that's very low. If, on the other hand, out of those 100 that are coming to a medical provider, 50 of them are intoxicated and need to be appropriately assessed, then you're already at the high level. So it's very, very indiscriminate. You have to use clinical experience. You have to use experience judgment. The event characteristics, expected levels of drug and alcohol problems, and expected levels of violence and disorder. This does include mosh pits before anybody asks that question, because you do get more injuries from a mosh pit. If you're doing a protest and that protest is violent, or if that protest has an opposing conflict, you are almost always going to be high or very high straight away. So if the risk of all of those is very low, then you can use first responders and only first responders. If, however, it's low, you're probably looking at paramedics or nurses to lead that service with the support of other staff. If it's medium, then any doctor can lead that service. But if it's a 4 or a 5, you need emergency medicine doctor-led services. Now, the Faculty of Pre-Hospital Care do provide specific qualification and CPD for those who are going to be providing event care. So if you as a medical provider are engaging doctors, this is where you need to start discriminating. So if you think you only need that doctor because it's going to be a little bit higher than a general practitioner or an acute medical doctor or somebody who works in primary care or early patient presentation, is going to be fine. If you've got doctors who work regularly on general surgical wards or outpatients, things like endocrinology, hematology, they're perhaps not the best doctor to be working in the event environment unless they've done additional qualifications or have recent additional exposure in the field, because the level of patients or the nature of patients that they're used to seeing is quite different. And likewise, when you get to high and very high levels, you really do want those doctors from the likes of emergency departments, or who work on HEMS, or who do regular basics work, because with all due respect, your general practitioner probably hasn't used their advanced life support skills in a number of years. They might not have requalified on them since their initial qualification. They might just requalify on basic life support because that's all they're going to need in their general day-to-day practice. So if we are engaging registered healthcare professionals, we do need to be taking into account what level of recent experience they have, not just the title that they come with. This risk matrix is to be jointly interpreted by both the medical provider and the event organizer. So generally speaking, it will be the event organizer that proposes where they feel the event sits, and it is for the event organizer to then provide evidence to justify any deviation from that. Of course, if the event organizer deems the event to be a higher risk and is happy to have higher levels of staff, then don't argue with that. You can accept their word at face value. But if you've deemed it to be a medium risk event and the event organizer is claiming it's very low, I would be expecting to see a lot of evidence and a lot of documentation to support that. Event organisers and licensing authorities should not regard the matrix as a prescriptive statement of the minimum cover acceptable or the service model appropriate for any particular event. The tool is intended only as a guide and should not take the place of clinical judgment based on experience. So I've been working in events for the last 14 years. I've been producing event safety plans or medical plans for the last 7 years. I would use my own judgment every single time. I will always go to this table and I will always write down where I feel it sits on this table, but I will then explain why I agree with that table or why I do not agree with that table based on the experience I've had over the last 16 and 7 years respectively. So once you've done that, the purple guide then goes on to tell you that a first responder led service is perhaps for an event with less than 2,000 attendees where there's no significant problems. It gives you some expected numbers. Now, a manager as an additional resource, absolutely if it's indicated, but not every event is going to need a dedicated manager. And it also says that you should be considering paramedics, and enhanced care practitioners, nurse practitioners to increase casualty assessment and stabilisation capacity where circumstances dictate. It also says you might want to consider having a site ambulance and crew if your event is held across a large area. You might have 2,000 attendees taking place in a Tough Mudder event. Is a first responder led service appropriate? Probably not. So this is a guide and this is where experience comes in. Your low risk events that require paramedics and nurses to lead them could be up to 10,000 attendees, but again, it's a low risk of significant problems. The purple guide suggests maybe 1 to 2 paramedics with 2 to 4 nurses, 2 first responders for every 4,000 attendees, and a manager. I would certainly say if you're looking at paramedics and nurses to lead your service, you should probably have a dedicated manager. Now, that manager doesn't need to be a paramedic or a nurse. Personally, I'm FREC 4, but I've got a lot of event management and a lot of event medical management experience, and I'd be happy and comfortable to lead that. And I've generally found in SAGs, they're very happy with me because of my experience. You might also want to have doctors, you might want site ambulances and crews, you might want rapid response vehicles, but you might not. It depends on the nature of the event and what you are risk assessing it to need. Going up into the levels where you need doctor-led services, these are for more attendees or where there are higher risks of high acuity presentations, and you're looking at multiple doctors, nurses, paramedics, or ECPs. Because you've got that higher skill base, you adjust your ratios, so it's now 2 first responders to every 5,000 attendees. It's saying you should pretty much have a site ambulance and crew and an RRV. It's saying you should have a dedicated road ambulance and crew for off-site transfers, and that's absolutely true, because if you've got a doctor there that's capable of initiating a hospital-led treatment, there's a very strong chance you're going to need that patient to be definitively treated in a hospital. Ultimately, we're only there to provide clinical care for the duration of the event, so if that patient has had some interventions and that care is going to be needed for several hours, then ultimately they are going to need to go into a secondary care facility, and that will impact on the NHS, but so would that happen if that happened in the street? Depending on where your event takes place, if it takes place a significant distance from your receiving hospitals, you might want to consider additional road ambulances. And if you've got this number of staff, so we're looking at, say, 2 doctors, 4 nurses, 2 paramedics, there's 8. If you've got 10,000 attendees, there's 4 first responders, so that's 12. Your site ambulance and crew, that makes you 14, and RRV is 15. Your road ambulance, that's 17. Your manager is 18. So with 18 staff now being present, you probably do want a dedicated controller to oversee all of those. And likewise, you can see with your emergency medicine doctor-led cover, it now gives you ratios dependent on the number of attendees you have. This is the only point where I would consider using the table to get my skills based on my attendees. Although personally, I would probably be a lot more cautious. I would probably be getting closer to 6 to 10 first responders for 25,000 attendees, because I'd be looking at the fact that the event's over quite a spread out area. And one of the things that we need to be making sure as providers that we do is provide a defibrillator with BLS trained personnel to any casualty within 8 minutes. So if you've got quite a dense crowd in front of your main stage, you are probably going to need a team in the stage pit. You're going to need a team at the front of the house, and you're going to need a team either side of the crowd to be able to get everywhere within that crowd within 8 minutes. Not forgetting you've also got the rest of your site to cover. So there are guidance out there, depending on what you're doing, as to what response times you need to meet. But I always go to what the NHS standards are, and that is for a Cat 1, which is a life-threatening emergency requiring a defib. You need to be able to get a defib and BLS resource within 8 minutes and a transporting resource within 19 minutes. That's the standard I try to work to at events as well. But for sports events, there are additional requirements, and I would use the appropriate guidance. There is a guide for road races for runners. The British Cycling Association have guides. There is guidance for boxing. There is certainly guidance for MMA. If there's professional sporting events, there are professional guidelines available. There is a guidance produced by one of the medical companies based down south. I believe it's part of the Medi4 group. They produced a guide for roller derby events. Have a search on Google and you will generally find the appropriate guidelines for the type of event that you're covering. And it's always worth making sure you review those, and it's worth ensuring that in your cover proposal, you document what you've done as part of your risk assessment and which band within that guideline you feel you fit into, and therefore what level of cover you need to be providing. And again, just to remind you that this matrix needs to be jointly interpreted by you and the event organizer, but it is not prescriptive. It is there as the first thing you look at, but your experience, your knowledge of similar events, your clinical knowledge, if you're from a hospital or an ambulance background, will ultimately guide you a lot better than these will. So we're now going to look at the green guide, and I'm just going to take that back off screen because I've got a little poll. When do you think the green guide was last updated, and who do you think authored the green guide? Let's have some opinions. Let's see how many of you have knowledge of working in sports grounds. I'm just going to mute myself while we get a few votes in. Okay, we've almost got 2/3 of you voted there, which is really good. Just going to give the last few of you a little chance to vote as well. Okay, that looks like we're almost at an end there, so I'm just going to end the polling. So the 4th edition of the Green Guide was issued in 1997. The 5th edition came out in 2008 and was a massive change compared to the 4th edition. But the biggest change to date was the 6th edition, which came out in 2018. This is available digitally, and ProMed admin team are about to provide you with the link in the chat there. It was authored by the Sports Ground Safety Authority. They are the authority that is responsible for providing guidelines which local authorities must adhere to when licensing sports grounds. The Health and Safety Executive can enforce things as well as local authorities, and the Events Industry Forum don't have anything to do with it. Let's have a little look. So what have we got? So the Green Guide is the colloquial name. It is officially known as the Guide to Safety at Sports Grounds, 6th edition. And some key points from this are that management, so the stadium or the sports ground management, must commission a medical risk assessment from a competent person or organisation who should consult with the local Ambulance Service NHS Trust, medical and first aid providers and crowd doctors as appropriate. So what this means is, as a provider, we should not be doing the risk assessment ourselves. It should be a competent person or another organisation. So quite often I have service partners I will use as consultants. I will say I've been asked to cover a sports ground on an ongoing basis. I will get one of my service partners or one of the healthcare professionals I know as a consultant who has experience in the industry. I will get them to produce the risk assessment and be paid directly by the sports ground management, and I will then produce the plan. Where a safety certificate is enforced, so not every sports ground needs to have a safety certificate, but where the sports ground meets the criteria for having a safety certificate, that consultation needs to be arranged through the local authority. So the local authority will need to approve the person who is going to conduct that risk assessment. So from those results, the management of the sports ground must produce a written medical plan defining a level of medical and first aid provision for spectators at the sports ground. Now, this is something that can be delegated to the medical provider, which is ourselves, but it has to be agreed and approved by the sports ground management. And what we look at here are the P and S factors. So in the chat, can somebody just throw up what we mean by a P or an S factor for a risk assessment? And while you're all trying to remember what P and S factors are, the definition of a sports ground in this context is a fixed building for spectators to watch organised competition sports events. So it generally means a stadium, but not necessarily a stadium. I am trying to remember the name of the act of law that defines them, and I'm hoping that somebody is going to give me the legislation that I'm forgetting. So now we're getting there. So P is physical factors and S is safety factors. So thanks, Alan. So physical factors include the design of the ground. So how many exits, how wide are they? What are the signage like? Where the seating, is the barriers of people standing? The physical factors. Then the S factors are the safety factors. So what stewarding is in place? Where are people going to be stood? What other facilities are provided to keep people safe? How long are we giving people to come in and sit down? How many doors do we open at the end to get everybody out? All of those different things need to be taken into consideration. So the medical plan for a sports ground is even more onerous than that for an event. However, personally, the event medical plans produced by ProMed are very much a hybrid that includes everything the purple guide wants and everything the green guide wants. So if you're running an outdoor temporary event that's not in a stadium, the medical plans that we produce tend to be far more comprehensive than you need. If you're running a sports ground one, it tends to have a few little added extras that aren't included in the green guide as well. Thank you, Paul. The Safety of Sports Grounds Act 1975 is what defines a sports ground in the context of this. So the medical plan for a sports ground needs to include the medical team command structure and lines of responsibility, the command and control systems on the ground, the size, location and number of permanent, temporary or mobile first aid rooms and facilities, all medical equipment and materials and their source, so who is providing them and where they're kept, the role, number and location of ambulances, their capabilities and crew competencies, and where they come from. So whether that's the NHS, the private provider or a different private provider, or whether it's something that permanently lives on that sports ground. The duties, numbers and location of crowd doctors, nurses, paramedics and first aid personnel. So that's not just which first aid post they're attached to, it includes which seats they will sit in while there is a tournament taking place within the area. The communication links to the members of the medical team inside the ground with other agencies and outside the ground. So that generally there is a stipulation for landline phones to be present. There needs to be direct external numbers to certain first aid posts and control positions. There can be internal extension numbers for others. We've got the procedure for the investigation and management of critical incidents. So for larger stadia, then there is usually an NHS ambulance officer assigned but for smaller ones, that may not be the case. The number and profile of the crowd, with particular reference to the likelihood of older people, younger children, and those with disabilities. And again, your medical plan might have several variations on that, because high profile tournaments may attract more audience of a certain profile, whereas a normal fixture with a team from a faraway land might have less of an audience. So your medical plan would need to incorporate all of the possible permutations of that. The time and duration of the event. Now, this typically stays the same for any particular type of sport, but if multiple sports are held within the ground, then you would need to include the permutations for each different sport. The procedures for inspecting the facilities and the equipment. So who is going to be responsible for inspecting the first aid posts, who is going to be responsible for servicing the equipment that lives at that stadium, and how often that's going to be carried out. The need to respond to particular weather conditions. So if your stadium is exposed or is otherwise outdoors, then what factors we're going to take into account, i.e. is it the middle of summer and it's bright and sunny with no shade, or is it the middle of winter and it is snowing and people are getting cold? The travel times and distances to local accident and emergency hospitals, both under normal running conditions and emergency running conditions. The response to a major incident, including triage procedures and casualty clearing locations and procedures, which do also include the procedures for dealing with fatalities, and that is a result of the Lord Taylor inquiry. And the necessary welfare facilities for all medical personnel. Specifically on that, it means that medical personnel should not be taking breaks in first aid posts. They need to have a separate area where they can eat, have a hot drink, and otherwise rest away from patients and members of the public. Absolutely right, the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act 1974 does apply because the general public were involved, and the Occupiers Liability Act, I can't remember the years, apply to visitors. Yes, so the term safety does include any person who is there by way of employment or work. It includes anybody who is there by way of performance or participation in sport, and anybody who is there by way of spectator, or any other visitor or member of the public who happens to be in the stadium at any period of time. We've mentioned about the particular sports governance bodies having specific requirements for medical support in order to permit the event to commence or to continue. So for instance, if you are doing a horse racing event where you must have one ambulance present on site for a race to start, think about, you've got your one ambulance there, a jockey comes off and you immobilise them, put them on an orthopaedic scoop, put them in the back of your ambulance and take them to hospital. At no point can racing continue until that ambulance comes back. So for all, the minimum is one ambulance. You might well consider providing 2 or 3 ambulances, depending on the nature of the route that horses are going to run over and the hazards they're going to encounter. As a general rule of thumb, the more jumps or the longer the jumps, the more ambulances you'd be looking to provide, because there's an increased likelihood of people being in the back of them needing to be treated. While somebody is in the back of an ambulance being treated, it is not available for immediate response, and so racing cannot continue even if it's still parked on site. The other important thing to note is that there is often a medical plan for spectators and a medical plan for participants and officials. They can and ideally should be the same plan, especially where the same provider is providing both, because that provides a very clear statement of responsibility, so it shows exactly where the line is. Very importantly, the provision for participants and the provision for spectators needs to be entirely separate. You can't say, I've got 10 first aiders and that is enough. You have to say, I have 8 first aiders for the very large crowd we have. I only need 2 first aiders for those competing in the sport. And at no point will I ever use the spectators, first aiders for the participants, even if those 2 first aiders are busy, because if you did, you would not have enough first aiders available for your spectators. Happily, where it comes to sports grounds, as event medical providers, we have massive leverage over our clients. It's the responsibility of the sports ground managers to provide a room or rooms designated for the provision of first aid to spectators, and that's in addition to the medical rooms that they've got for the participants. Suitable site needs to be identified as a secondary first aid post if our primary first aid post isn't available, so that guarantees us 2. And ground management are responsible for the upkeep and cleanliness of those rooms. So as providers, we are in a absolutely golden position because we can happily turn around and say, it says in this document, you need to provide the first aid room. We're telling you what we need. You need to give us a room big enough. Event organisers, we don't get to turn around to them and say that. We generally have to beg for what we want, but in a sports ground, it is absolutely explicit and the onus is on the sports ground management. There also needs to be in that plan suitable arrangements for the procurement and replacement of medical and first aid equipment. That can be our responsibility as a provider, or it can be the responsibility of management. It needs to be negotiated in that quotation stage because obviously we will be charging more money if we were going to replace the consumables. That being said, we would prefer to replace consumables ourselves because we know what's used on any given event straight away, and we can just replace that from our own internal stores and then replenish our stores at a much later date. So even if we're having supplier issues, it wouldn't affect the viability of running the next event at the stadium because we've already restocked that. Let's have a little look. Sports ground management need to ensure that defibrillators are provided at all events. So if there are no defibrillators permanently provided on site, the medical provider needs to provide them. Generally speaking, if we're taking over a contract at a sports ground, what we would do is we would have a look. If they don't already have defibrillators, we would look at providing them in the way of public access defibrillators in essentially locked alarmed cabinets, which we unlock on sports days. We might have 1 or 2 on a code lock in perhaps a reception area, or maybe bolted onto the outside of the stadium on a code lock with the information known to the NHS Ambulance Service and Good SAM app. Those inside the stadium we would keep locked, but then one of the duties that would be done before opening is that we would go around and unlock those cabinets. They would be alarmed, and wherever possible, we would have those linked so that if the alarm goes off, it activates something in a first aid post or the control room, so we know that defib is being removed because it gives us that early warning that we're going to be needed if we're not already. If we've got doctors, nurses and paramedics, we need to make sure that we have manual defibs so that those ALS providers can use them at their skill grade. Otherwise, automatic or preferably in our case, semi-automatic defibrillators should be available for every BLS crew. So unless we have a ground where there are literally defibs located every 2 minutes, then every response team would have an AED. Management need to provide secure storage for the first aid materials and equipment, except any that we bring in and take away. So generally that's achieved by a first aid post having a locked door and either linked into the central stadium alarm or preferably an independent alarm within the first aid post that perhaps then signals to the wider alarm. And that's just because quite often, unless there's an event going on, the first aid post will be locked, but the stadium itself might be disalarmed whilst grounds are doing a bit of maintenance. The responsibility for ensuring the presence of competent personnel lies with the sports ground management. So they can appoint 1 or more organisations to supply the number or range of skills that they need. Generally, that's obviously in the contract that if it weren't to be fulfilled, then a penalty would be levied against the medical provider. But ultimately, it means that in no way would a sports ground manager decide to open the doors without that provision being in place, because they are then liable themselves, not just the medical provider. It says that where there are more than 2,000 people in the crowd, then there should be a crowd doctor immediately available. The doctor's first duty is to the crowd, and they need to hold the pre-hospital emergency care course and the MIMS qualification and have relevant experience, and that their location and contact details need to be known by every member of first aid and ambulance staff and the event control room, who can all make immediate contact with them. Crowd doctor has to be there before we admit spectators and again remain until we leave. So let's just have a little look. Ruth, what are everyone's thoughts about when first aid requirements are not met specifically in sport? Officially speaking, the event should not be continuing. I've never had to walk off site yet. I have threatened event organisers with removing the cover from site. that then makes them think twice. So if they've booked the minimum level of cover and we've expressly stated if that ambulance needs to go off site, or if our ringside team is dealing with a patient who got knocked out on the ring, then they're not starting their next bout, for example. And they say, okay, well, we're happy with that, but then they turn around on the day and say, yeah, we're going to start the next fight, just get used to it. You kind of go, no, you're not. And they go, yeah, we are. I say, okay, no problem. We'll take this patient away now. See you later. We're not providing any more cover as of this moment in time. We'll write that down on paper. And then they'll go, oh, actually, yeah, we'll call a break now. Now you mention it. The threat works because they realise without cover, then they're wholly liable. But, I've never had to withdraw cover, but if necessary, I would. Let's have a little look. If you are attending events with little or no provision, then there's two things you can do. You can speak to the event organizer and obviously tell them that you're not particularly happy because your child is competing and you want there to be provision to be available if your child were to become ill or injured through the event. You could also speak to other parents, which would also perhaps put a little bit of pressure on the event organizer, because if a lot of parents are kind of feeling and saying the same things, then the event organizer will feel that pressure. You could also privately message us with who the events are, and we will make contact and offer them information. Neil O'Gorman, I am well and truly aware that LAS do not support locked pads. I'm also well and truly aware that there are more reports of stolen defibrillators in London than in any other police force area across the whole country. I am not at all suggesting that having unlocked public access defibrillators is the direct cause of more defibrillators being stolen. It could just be that more criminals live within London Ambulance Service's operational area who just happen to all be opportunistic. I wouldn't like to speculate on causality. However, it takes a call taker seconds to click the address card and read out a number. If they can read out an address risk to a crew, they can read out a combination number to a member of the public, in my personal opinion. Also, Good SAMA allows you to write down the access codes in the app, which is then released. Responders can obviously see that information in full. Alerters will get that information if they activate an alert. Let's just have a look. Yes, it can be very woolly for some parent bodies. I tend to find if there isn't necessarily a parent body with appropriate guidelines, there might be a set of guidance for a similar kind of sport, and I would use that similar kind of sport, but I would include in my medical plan that caution has been applied when using this because it is not for this specific sport. Let's have a little look. Yes, praying for Christianity is yes, I will pray this defib doesn't get stolen. Yes. Ultimately, we're not going to provide a defib that isn't secure, and nor would we ever recommend to anybody to provide a defib that isn't secure, because I'm absolutely certain I know what the insurer would say. If it is not locked, then we are not going to insure it if it is stolen. That's pretty much every insurance policy I've ever read. And unless, Neil, you want to show me some evidence to the contrary, I'm pretty sure LAS don't have an indemnity that if you provide a public access defib in an unlocked cabinet, they will provide a replacement defib for you. But yes, Ruth, just privately message us the names of the events. We will happily have a chat with those event organisers, obviously with a view to getting some business ourselves. I'm not going to lie, but at the very least, from an event medical provider's perspective, just make them a bit more aware of the risks that they're opening themselves up to. And then if they still choose not to provide that cover, then oh dear. So I'm going to look at safety advisory groups. They look a little bit like this. A lot of people, usually in shirts and ties, sat around with laptops and notepads and pens and paper and all the rest, discussing events. It is very much a suit kind of affair. So they're organised by the local authority, possibly by the events team, possibly by the licensing team, possibly by another team. It depends on the authority which your event falls under. So the statutory services, so your police, your fire and rescue, and your NHS ambulance service are entitled to an invitation. There is no kind of legislation around safety advisory groups, but it's an expectation. I think it's fair to say that the statutory services need to be invited, and I've certainly not been to a SAG where they haven't been. You'll also have representatives from the local authorities, licensing authority, the environmental health team, and any other of their departments which they feel are necessary. They would also be inviting the event organizer or the event producer. And that's a bit of a minimum realistically. Beyond that, on-site safety services, so for example, ourselves as a medical provider, the crowd safety management team, the security team, and any other teams on site who have a role to play in terms of safety may be invited. Quite often that falls down to the discretion of who the event organizer wants to bring with them, or if a statutory service wants a particular provider to be present in order to engage in some meaningful dialogue with them, they could also perhaps directly invite them. Other people who may get invited, depending on where you are. I do know of one event within the Greater Manchester area where the Mountain Rescue Team is invited. I do know of events near the coast where the RNLI gets invited. And there are other kind of services similar to that who may be invited depending on where the event takes place. I'm pretty sure off the top of my head, Mint Command, one of the events they do in the Lake District, Mountain Rescue gets invited to the SAG for that. We're just going to go back to the Purple Guide 5.6, which says event organisers and licensing authorities should not regard the matrix as a prescriptive statement of the minimum accepted cover or the appropriate service model. That also applies to SAGs, that also applies to NHS ambulance services. So where you are being asked to use a matrix, it needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. And if people in your SAG are reading a risk assessment based on either HSG 195 or the Purple Guide website and are demanding that you use the outcome of that, then you need to show them paragraph 5.6, and you need to be prepared to absolutely stand on that point and make it a non-negotiable point. And I have had to refuse to continue a conversation until they've accepted 5.6. And if you stand your ground on that, it might take a while. I think the longest it's taken me is 20 minutes to get past that issue. But if you do stand your ground, they do eventually accept that. But if they're going to try and hold you to something, they need to justify why they're doing that rather than relying on clinical and operational experience of similar events, because we do know that that experience is much more appropriate to use in these instances. By the time you get to a SAG, you should have a named medical manager. So in ProMed, we actually have 3. So we would have a project manager who would attend the SAGs. They may or may not be the same as one of the 2 on-site people, the on-site people being the medical coordinator who liaises with everybody and the medical manager who looks after our staff. But by the time we get to SAG, usually all 3 of those are named. Usually only the project manager will come to a SAG, but if it is the kind of final pre-event SAG, we may turn up in force, if you will, with everybody, just so that people can kind of put faces to names and kind of get a handle on who's who and how they operate. Whoever is there representing the medical provider does need to be prepared to defend and justify the cover proposal and the operational plan if any challenge is raised. Now, it's important to bear in mind, however, that a safety advisory group doesn't actually have any legal powers. So whilst they might challenge you and whilst they might want an answer and want to know that things are being done right, they don't actually have any powers if they disagree with you. That being said, however, the individual organisations on the SAG do have their own powers. So the police certainly have powers. The licensing authority certainly has powers to make conditions. The ambulance service has very few powers. The fire and rescue service has more powers. So it depends on what issue is raised as to whether an organisation would consider to use their powers in terms of enforcing something. But the safety advisory group as an entity legally doesn't come with any powers. So I'm just going to ask a little recap on what we've talked about there, because safety advisory groups do quite often cause a bit of confusion for people. So can a safety advisory group impose conditions that an event organizer is legally obliged to follow? Is that true or is that false? And which of the following groups are always invited to a SAG meeting? And that's out of the event organizer, the police, mountain rescue, the NHS ambulance service, the licensing authority, the event medical provider, the event stewarding provider, the county fire and rescue service, Her Majesty's Coast Guard, and the event production company. Okay, almost 2/3 of you have voted. I'm just going to give you another 20 seconds or so for everybody else. Okay, thanks to everyone who's voted there. So, question 1, a SAG can impose conditions that an event organizer is legally obliged to follow, is false. So well done to the 12 of you who answered that one correctly. The SAG itself cannot impose conditions. In terms of who is always invited to a SAG meeting, everybody, let's have a look, 84% of you said the event organizer, yes, they will always be invited. 74% of you said the police, yes, they are always going to be invited. 5% of you said mountain rescue, nope, they will only be invited if the event is taking place in an area that might be of interest to them. 53% of you said the NHS ambulance service, they are always going to be invited. They do quite often decline, but they will always get an invite. The licensing authority, and 84% of you have said, again, no, they aren't always going to be invited. They will only be invited if the event is subject to a license or a temporary event notice. 42% said the event medical provider, nope, we're not always going to be invited, only if the SAG is interested or if the event organizer wants us there for a particular point. Same goes for the event stewarding provider. The county fire and rescue service, 37% of you said that. Actually, they're always going to get an invite. Of the services, they are probably the one that will decline most often. They might attend one if they're a bit concerned about structures or fire points, fire towers, but generally speaking, they tend not to come along. They might just make a written submission. HM Coast Guard, 0% of you, correct. They will only rock up if it's near water and they have an interest. The event production company, 11% of you said that. Nope. The event organizer will be invited. The event production company will only be brought along by an event organizer. So yes, if you follow the recommendations of SAG, your insurer is going to protect you. If you don't follow a SAG proposal, absolutely speak to your insurer first, because if you don't, they may not insure you, because ultimately you've been given guidance and advice, and if you're not following that guidance and advice, they are going to want to know why you've not done that. Legal advice from your insurers, absolutely. They are the ones who are going to cover your ass in court, so what they say goes. And generally, before you run your event, that advice is going to be free of charge. After you run your event, it might prove very costly if you didn't get it first. In terms of NHS ambulance services, we're going to be wanting to speak to the emergency planning, resilience and response team, or the events team, depending on which trust you fall under. LAS, it's EPRR, NEAS, it's EPRR, YAS has an events team. Who else do I know off the top of my head? CCAM have an events team. Trying to think of all the others that I know. I believe EMAS, you speak to EPRR, SWAST is EPRR. Whoever was from West Mids, if you wouldn't mind letting me know who we would speak to there. And ultimately what we're trying to do is delineate where the area of responsibility lies, and you come to an agreement. Simon, thank you. It's EPRR, and yes, Nick, I am EPRR for EMAS. In the majority of cases, it is. There's just the odd one or two that have an events team specifically for that. So you want to agree the provider's area responsibility. Now, for a greenfield site where you're doing a typical festival, that's very easy. It tends to follow the red line of the license application. In the case of events within town centres, city centres, on streets, tends to be more difficult. In parks, quite easy. You tend to just use the park boundary. Where it's on streets, it's a little bit more difficult because part of your event might well block off areas that is, officially speaking, the area of responsibility of the NHS Ambulance Service. You might landlock them if you're doing a marathon, for example. But generally speaking, in exchange for that, the NHS Ambulance Service might well choose to attend certain areas of your event where they happen to have a closer vehicle, because you're kind of covering areas of them. It's very much a negotiation. It's very much based on what your client has already agreed to. But yeah, if you're landlocking an area and you can't get an NHS vehicle across quickly, expect to be given responsibility for it. Just negotiate a little compromise elsewhere on your route, and generally it's all good. On events usually of that size, you'll have an EPRR sat next to you in the control room, and you tend to work very closely together. Depending on how many people you're bringing in, you might have a little area beyond your car park or between your event and the public transport hubs to be responsible for. It might be that if it comes in on treble 9, they'll ask you if you've got a closer resource, and likewise, if it comes into you and it's off your event, you might speak to the NHS and say they've got a closer resource. It's very, very much a compromise, but it is get it wrote down in writing before the event starts, and then everybody knows where they stand. The other thing is, in a major incident, the event medical provider will have a role in holding the fort until the NHS Ambulance Service is able to take over the medical management of the incident, and thereafter will have a support role with any available resources, as well as running BAU across the rest of the event. Now, as I've said in previous webinars, what that means is we will launch our command structure immediately in that major incident. We will commence triage and possibly set up the casualty clearing station. And we will only hand over the responsibility of medical management of that incident when an appropriately senior officer or officers turn up to have those command roles, because we want to minimise the unnecessary handovers of command. And we've been running that incident quite comfortably for 10 to 15 minutes before they've turned up. We don't want them introducing new systems when there's already existing systems working perfectly well. And again, it's worth having that documented in advance and agreed with the NHS Ambulance Service, so that they know if you do go and declare a major incident, they know what officers they need to be sending and what roles they'll have and who they need to speak to in order to take over, rather than just rocking up and going, ooh, what are we actually doing here? So just to elaborate on that a little bit more, it's essential that we have planned and rehearsed the escalation plans. So on the larger events where the NHS is going to have an officer there, we tend to do a tabletop a week or two beforehand and then just run through so if this happens, what are we going to be doing? If this happens, what are you going to be doing? You're probably going to be quite busy on the phone or on your airwave. We're probably going to be quite busy on the radio. So actually, should we just pass notes to each other? What are we going to write on those notes to each other? How are we going to know when your officers get here? We're just going to tabletop it all out and kind of work that plan through with people who are going to be there on the day, because that is just going to mean that if we do go into that scenario, there's less for us to think about at the time. Key staff need to have clearly defined command roles and be fully tested. So it's officially the event organiser's responsibility to encourage engagement from the local ambulance service, especially for larger events. That being said, ProMed, we will contact the ambulance service where an event's taking place. We do that whether we're providing a couple of first aiders to a little fair. We do that if we're providing a multidisciplinary team of 20 first aiders for a weekend event. Because at least they know the event's taking place, at least they have a contact number for us. And again, even if we've just got BLS with AED in a town centre for something taking place in a park, we'll still give dispatch a quick ring in the morning, say hello, this is ProMed, this is what we've got, this is why we're here. If you get treble 9, do feel free to give us a ring, because even if it's not to do with our event, if we can get there with a defib in 2-3 minutes, morally, I feel that we should be doing that. And then handing it over. Obviously, if a treble 9 comes in from within our event, we don't want to look stupid by having an ambulance drive past our first aid post into the middle of the event because somebody is having a seizure and nobody told us. So just exchanging that information in the morning is really good. And then obviously, if you have said that you are present on a site, the really important thing to do is to ring them up when you leave site. If you're going to be there beyond the shift change, if I've got an event that is passing kind of 5-6 o'clock, whether that's day or night, I will just ask whoever I'm speaking to when I sign on, and I'll just go, just to check what time's your handover in the control room. I'll make a note of that, and about 15-20 minutes afterwards, I'll give them a quick ring, especially weekend events, and I'll just go, yeah, just let you know it's ProMed here. We've still got this number of staff. Are we still shown as being live on your system within this boundary? Yes, you are. Fantastic, lovely. Have you still got a phone number? Yes, lovely. Right, okay. Then we know that next shift is well aware that we're still there and that we can, be tasked to things within the event if they get a treble 9 call. And really importantly, the prevalence of mobile phones amongst public these days is actually more likely that you're going to get a treble 9 call than somebody running to find the nearest steward. So what else have we got? It's important that NHS and other blue light staff are made aware of key personnel on site for liaison and whether the event medical providers commenced effective triage and initial casualty management. There needs to be a handover responsibility document drawn up in advance between the ambulance service and the event medical provider, setting out how and when the assets of the medical provider are handed over to the statutory ambulance service and the handback procedure and any equipment replenishment that may come with that if it's a major incident. And if that's all done in advance, so much better. The other thing that we need to be doing is speaking with our acute NHS trusts. So by acute NHS trusts, we mean the trust with a responsibility for a hospital that has an accident and emergency department. So ideally, we need to be speaking to the emergency planning and preparedness department. They are notoriously difficult to find on websites. It is really, really difficult to search for and find a direct contact with them. Over the years, we've built up the ones with the hospitals we've had to speak to, but there are still large numbers of hospitals where we don't have that. Generally speaking, I just ring switchboard, explain what I am, why I'm ringing, and that I wish to speak to the emergency planning department. and they will give me the name of who I need to speak to, or several names. They will give me an email address or email addresses, and they will give me either a direct phone number, or they'll offer to transfer me to them. At least that way I'm able to make a communication with them. The other thing I'm interested in knowing is the facilities at all intended receiving hospitals. So do they have PPCI? Do they have a hyperacute stroke unit? Can they take PEDS trauma? Are they a trauma unit or major trauma or not? Can they receive major burns? Do they have vascular stabilization? Those kind of things, the things that frontline ambulance crew would want to know. We want to know, because ultimately, if we are transporting from our event site, chances are if we're transporting in an emergency, we are transporting for one of those reasons. So it's no good taking the local ED if we've got a STEMI, if that ED doesn't have a PPCI. Likewise, there are some hospitals that have PPCI facilities but don't actually have an ED. And it's important that we know about them if they're within the travelling radius for our event. If we're going to find out about those facilities, it's pointless knowing about them and whizzing our patient in on blue lights if we've not pre-alerted them, especially for things like hyperacute strokes and PPCI, because if there's nobody at the unit waiting to open the doors, then we've just wasted those blue lights, because we're going to be stood outside the doors for 5-10 minutes. And again, we'll get them from emergency planning preparedness. Where I've been unsuccessful in speaking to emergency planning and preparedness, I generally find speaking to ED reception and explaining who we are, what we are. Generally, then an ED consultant or an ED manager will give us a call back and confirm who we are, what the event is, and why we want them, and they'll then go, absolutely, here it is. Very rarely, in one instance, I have shown my face in ED on the morning of the event, before the event opened, and said, hi, we're 3 miles away, we've got 4 ambulances. Hopefully we're not going to need to bring anybody in, but if we do, it's because you've got PPCI, hyperacute stroke and trauma, and I'd like to give you a heads up before we rock up at the door. And then they've kind of gone, oh yeah, you rang us, oh right, yeah, this is actually like real, you weren't making it up. Yes, here's the phone numbers you'll need. And again, if you're an event medical provider, it's worthwhile not just putting them in your medical plan, but actually keeping a spreadsheet or a database of all those numbers, and then they're there for the next time you've got an event in that area. So we're just going to have a little look. Which of these do you think are relevant to know about as an event medical provider if we're going to transport patients off site? So you can select as many of those as you like. It's primary percutaneous coronary intervention, or PPCI, trauma unit or major trauma centre, occupational therapy, maternity, physiotherapy, major burns, outpatients, a paediatric emergency department, a haematology service, and genitourinary medicine or gum clinic. I suspect this may not be the multiple choice question I thought I'd set it as, so answer any you feel is relevant. Neil, I do know where you live, and I do have the local gum clinic's phone number. So if you stay on the chat, I'll happily provide that for you. None of us here have got any judgment. It's very well and good that everybody gets checked out regularly if they're sexually active. So well done for being brave and saying that. Going back to our questions. Primary percutaneous coronary intervention, definitely something we want to know about. Same for trauma unit. OT, nah, that's not anything we're going to take in for. Maternity, going to want to know about maternity. Physio, not really that bothered. Major burns, definitely want to know about those because they're few and far between. Some areas you don't even have one, so it's worth noting that in particular. because if you do have to go quite wide off site for major burns and you've got a patient with one, that will be the conversation with the control room about something nice and big with rotas on it. And more importantly, your medical plan should actually tell you where you want that to land and pick the patient up from. Don't care at all about outpatients. Absolutely 100% care about a PED. Hematology, no, not bothered. And I'm not bothered about genitourinary medicine. Neil, yep, obviously you're a regular. That's absolutely fine. As I say, it's great. And that's all we need to know about acute NHS trusts. So as we're kind of 40 minutes overrunning, this has been a really long one, really detailed. I'm pleased everybody stayed, so thank you for staying. And I do apologise that's overrun by so long. In terms of detailed planning, the details of the cover that we're going to provide needs to be in writing and in a formal medical plan. So this needs to include information sharing protocols between the named medical manager, the NHS, the event safety manager, and any memorandums of understanding that we have. Because it's important that everybody understands who's going to do what for both business as usual and a major incident scenario. We're going to have our named managers in there so that everybody knows who they need to speak to. And we're going to detail the infrastructure and support requirements that we need to do our job. So if we're going to get structures from the event, how big a marquee do we need? How much power do we need? Where in that marquee do we need the power? How many dividers do we need? Where do we need them? If we're not putting that right next to hard standing, how much trackway do we need? How wide does that trackway need to be for a turning circle for a Cat C1 ambulance? Because if you've driven them, you will know that they have a turning circle of a house. We're going to detail the staff numbers and the skill mix, and that includes the arrangements for those numbers. So how are they staying overnight if it's a multi-day event? If it's a long event, how are we feeding them? What are we going to have shower facilities? What toilets are we going to have, including toilets for patients? Where staff are going to park, and preferably for free. We're going to detail what vehicles we're going to provide, and if it's off-road, what four-wheel drive capabilities are we going to have? We're also going to be looking for those taking place in showgrounds and stadiums, what permanent structures are there, who's going to look after them and clean them while the event's live. We're going to make sure that everything's clean, safe and accessible. We're going to document how that's going to be achieved. We're going to make sure that we've got suitable capacity for both normal operations and any surges, and we're going to make sure that they're easily accessible for both the public and also for any off-site services that we need. And preferably we're going to design it so that foot traffic and pedestrians doesn't come into contact with vehicle traffic. So if we can segregate those, it keeps them a lot safer. We're also going to have some consideration for where the fire, the police, the welfare services are. It might be that we are going to document that we are going to co-locate with welfare, and particularly we're going to have a little back corridor that we can transfer patients between one facility and the other without going into the public realm. And we're going to document exactly what each facility is going to be doing and what their anticipated workload is going to be. We need to make sure that we've got robust and reliable communications. So if we're using radios, how many channels, what channels they are, so that no other service accidentally uses the same ones. If we've got a medical control facility, where that's going to be located, who's going to represent us in joint agency control, what requirements we have in terms of internet access, networking, power, redundant power, and so on. If we're using radios, if we're in control facilities, where are we going to put those aerials, making sure that they're not in conflict with us. We're also going to be looking at the command structure, who's in charge, who is next below them, and ultimately all the way down to those first aiders on the ground. Smaller events might not have control teams, but we need to know how we're going to contact the medical provider. So in the case of ProMed, what we do is we provide a 0333 number, which is given to every single steward, security, fire marshal, event organizer, performer, Tom, Dick, Harry. We even put it on signs in the arena. We'll put it on social media so that everybody has a direct number for the medical team. Sometimes that might go to a phone in the first aid post. Sometimes if there's 4 first aiders, it will just ring all 4 of their mobile numbers simultaneously. All of those calls are recorded. but that just keeps it nice and simple. It might be that we use a channel that is programmed into everybody's radio, that everybody can access, so they just change to channel 9 and speak to the medical team. We all monitor that, but then if we need to discuss a particular patient, we might go to channel 10, which is only programmed into the medical team radios. As I've mentioned earlier, we'll speak to the NHS about those calls and making sure that they can direct calls to us and we can direct calls to them. In terms of our records policy and GDPR arrangements, we know that all patient contacts will need to be recorded and patient care records held, and that we're going to keep those confidential. So we're going to document how we're going to achieve that. It might just be as simple as providing that those standard policies for the event organizer to peruse and be happy with. The other thing that's going to include is the type of event, the event location, those sterile access and egress routes, the start and finish times of the event, and the start and finish times of the contracted cover. It's going to have site plans, which include the sterile access routes. It's going to mark on the helicopter landing zone. It's going to include information about any likely queues and the welfare for people queuing. We're going to make sure that the event organisers get a copy of our insurance documentation, public and products liability, employers liability, medical indemnity, fleet insurance, and any medical defence documentation for specialised staff. At ProMed, we provide those as routine to our clients. We don't wait for our client to ask for them. We provide them just out of good practice and due diligence. We'll provide copies of our safeguarding and deprivation of liberty policies, our infection control policies, our uniform policies, our health and safety policies. Many of them are actually available to download on our website, but we just provide them as individual PDFs for the event organizer, so that event organizer can keep them on file and show how they've been compliant and have done their due diligence on us. We'll also have the escalation plans within the overall medical plan. We'll have resilience planning, so for anything that's a threat to life or terror related, or today COVID related, we'll make sure they're included in the medical plan as well. The safety stakeholders, so we've got an event control room at a cricket stadium there with a CCTV operator. I'm not going to mention the name of the organisation providing cover there, but it's clearly not ProMed. But the health and safety officer, somebody who, as an event medical coordinator, I'm going to be talking to probably every 2 or 3 hours. The crowd safety manager, I want to be hearing from them every 2 or 3 hours as well. The security manager, I'm going to be wanting to hear from them every 2 to 3 hours, or maybe I'm going to be giving updates to them every 3 or 4 hours. The event production manager, I'll certainly be seeing 2 or 3 times across the day. And the site manager, might see them once a day, but I might need stuff from them. So I certainly want to know who they are and I want to be building up a good rapport with them. So just to recap what we've gone through tonight, we've looked at what we're going to need right from the first time that a client asks us to quote, whether that's a phone call or an email. What I tend to do in response to an initial inquiry, unless they've got half an hour on the phone, if they've rang me right there and then, if they email me, I'll arrange a time when they've got half an hour to an hour and I'll have an informal chat, and it'll, it's informal. I keep it very friendly, very relaxed, but I'm asking them all of those questions, the who, what, where, when, why, and how, come through that conversation, that chat. They feel put at ease, but they also feel very reassured that we're going into the appropriate level of depth and putting them at ease through the process. We've looked at how we risk assess the event, so we've taken that information and we've produced something from it, and we've used the green guide, the purple guide, and other support and documentation to do that. We know how we're going to use that to work with our safety advisory groups and how we justify things to them. Throughout this, we've liaised with the local Ambulance Service NHS Trust and the acute NHS Trust emergency planning teams. And we've then developed our detailed plan with the client and production team, and we've got all of that in writing, and then we've shared that with key safety stakeholders. So thank you to the, let's have a look, 22 of you who've remained throughout this evening. If you would like your CPD certificate, you just need to email webinars@promed999.co.uk with your full name. Please make sure it includes your full name and email address that you use to log into Zoom so we can verify your attendance. In addition to verifying that you're in this session, we are also going to verify that you have left us a review. So on the next slide, we'll tell you about that. But please make sure you have left us at least one review, preferably more, because we're on multiple platforms. From the later of when you email us or your review has been published, it'll be 3 business days to get your certificate. I'm aware that some of you have emailed us recently about previous certificates. We will get those done tomorrow. We're aware there's a little bit of a backlog from the weekend onwards. As we've said, we have provided tonight's webinar free of charge. So as a thank you, if you wouldn't mind leaving us a review, that can be 1 star, 2 stars, 4 stars, 5 stars. Please be honest in your feedback. If you don't rate us the full 5 stars, please just let us know how you think we could improve the webinar. We want these to be as great as they possibly can be for you, and constructive criticism and feedback is absolutely welcome. We are on Trustpilot. We are on Yell, we are on Google, and we are on Facebook, and those links are being placed in the chat by ProMed web team, so you can just click on them. Alternatively, if you've received a certificate from us in the past, or you've received one of the MailChimps from us, the links should be on there as well. I'm going to just quickly ask what you think of tonight's webinar. I can see that quite a few of you are saying it's been really instructive, really informative, really good. Good to see we're working together, really interesting. Absolutely great. You know, we love providing these for you. So if you could just very quickly fill in that, whether you'd recommend us to your friends or colleagues, and whether you think we're excellent, satisfied, in the middle, or whether you're unsatisfied, or whether you thought this was poor quality, that would be great. I'm just going to move the slide on as well. I'm going to go on to our question and answer session. So if you do have any questions at all, please do ask us. The only stupid question is the question that isn't asked, because if you've got a question, then actually somebody else has that same question, and it might be something that I've not thought about, and that's why I've not included it, but it might be something that is really burning for you and everybody else. So any questions, you can raise your hand, and if you raise your hand, I'll invite you to speak, or you can just post it in the chat. For everybody saying thank you and that these are getting better, yeah, all very welcome. It's an absolute pleasure to be networking with professionals across the industry every week. It is a highlight of my week to see so many people turning up and interacting and asking questions. And what's really good for me is I now know that there are people across the country I can turn to for advice if I need to sound them out, if I have any questions, or if I need some additional bodies to help me out with something. I now have a good list of people who I would trust to help me, because you've all engaged so well with these webinars. Neil O'Gorman, absolutely, in small areas, mobile masks can't cope with usage from the crowd, and mobile communications, as we mentioned last week, mobile phones are not a reliable form of communications for any event professionals. Alan, you're absolutely right. The police can prohibit things from happening with prohibition orders, and the councils can issue stop orders, and licensing authorities can simply refuse a license. That's as far as we need to go with the previous stuff, because I know I've answered everything else. Are there any control over event providers? I see many cowboy outfits about disconcerting, really. Dave, unfortunately not. The event first aid, event ambulance, and event medical industry is largely unregulated. The regulation comes in terms of you must be registered with the Care Quality Commission if you provide ambulance services, and that ambulance service is within the meaning of off-site transportation, so taking to and from a place of treatment. In terms of triage provided remotely, that only applies where the triage is remote from the site where it takes place, so providing advice and information over a radio doesn't qualify. And in terms of treatment for disease, disorder and injury, there is a specific exemption in there for sporting or cultural events. Yes, the CQC, Care Quality Commission, only applies within England. It doesn't apply to Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland. So in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, it's even less regulated than in England. And in England, it's kind of half-assed registration in certain circumstances. Is pretty much the top and bottom of that. You're right, it is disconcerting. What's even more worrying is that there's a significant volume of event organisers out there who do not take their responsibilities seriously, who do not do their due diligence, and if they're not doing their due diligence, they can use, shall we say, less than reputable providers. Yeah, the best way to complain is to write to their insurers. If you see something that they would not be insured for, it is worth letting their insurers know, but then you would need to know their insurers. And if they're a less than scrupulous company, first of all, are they actually insured? I do know event organisers that don't bother checking that. Secondly, yeah, it is incredibly worrying. I'm not going to say competitor, an organisation that I know very well. I know their directors personally. I've worked with them in many different ways before. They have a quote that they use as part of their marketing, which is outstanding medical cover isn't cheap, and cheap medical cover is never outstanding. That is some words I agree with. Sadly, I can't use them for my marketing because yeah, that wouldn't be good. I'd be ripping them off basically. But yeah, no, it's absolutely true there. The only way things are going to change ultimately is with prosecutions. I feel there was a landmark case in 1999 where an event organizer was prosecuted in terms of inadequate medical provision. However, that's 21 years ago, and I feel that that has certainly slipped from the corporate memory of some of the newer or less reputable event organisers. And certainly 31 years ago was Hillsborough. And I think without the Sports Guide Safety Authority and the licensing authorities for those, I do feel that a corporate memory would already be fading as well. It's absolutely, it is worrying. All we can do as providers is remain professional, do what we do best, and try and explain and encourage organisers to do their due diligence and give them all of our own information up front so that they can do that on us. Because if they can see what a reputable provider has in place and should be providing, then it may cause them to ask questions of the less reputable providers, and ultimately, they are going to look at where the pound signs are. But if they realise that it's going to cost them more money if something goes wrong, then they may well choose correctly. While I'm waiting to see if there's any more questions, I've just asked us which of the following webinars you would be interested in. We are running them at Thursday evenings at 7 p.m. If there's any you're interested in, just tick the box. You can definitely vote for multiple ones of these, so submit them and let me know. Can't see any questions in the chat, so let's just give you another couple of minutes. Raise your hand if you'd like to talk and ask a question, or you can have a couple of minutes to type something if you have any more questions. Okay, well, the last couple of you are just letting me know what you would like us to do in terms of priority orders for our next webinars. Next week, Thursday, the 13th of August at 7 p.m, we are going to be looking at patient tracking at major incidents. You will get to see our cloud-based very rapid deployment solution that can be very, very quickly and easily shared. You will also see our plans for rapid deployment telephone solutions and how easy things can be for people on the ground. And you'll get to understand the patient journey right from the incident occurring, where they could be anywhere, right through the initial triage, the secondary triage, direction to any rest centres, casualty clearing stations or survivor reception centres, possibly through any onward transportation, possibly getting into a hospital emergency department, being transferred to a ward, being transferred to a hospital near their home, and ultimately being discharged, or otherwise, if they go down a fatality pathway, any kind of body holding areas, temporary mortuaries, permanent mortuaries, undertakers, and ultimately funerals and burials there. So we're going to look at all those pathways and the importance of making sure that we're tracking things, the importance of kind of photography within that as well. Thank you, everyone's now voted. I'll clear that from your screens. The JESIP Joint Doctrine and Joint Decision Model session is on Thursday, the 3rd of September at 7 p.m. The 20th of August is Radio Communications Protocol and Demonstrations. And the 27th of August, we will be looking at, the 20th of August, we look at filling out patient clinical report forms correctly. The 27th of August, we look at radio communications protocol and demonstrations. The rest of September is up on our website, www.promed999.co.uk/training. And our October plan will be prioritised based on what you guys have said you would like to do. Finally, just to remind you, if you'd like your CPD certificates, please email webinars@promed999.co.uk with your full name and your email address as it appeared on Zoom this evening, so we can verify that you're in this session. We'll also be looking on our 4 review sites to make sure you have left us a review before we'll issue your certificate, and we'll email them out to you within 3 business days of the review or the email, whichever comes later. The webinar has been free of charge, so please leave us a review on Trustpilot, on Yelp, on Google, or on Facebook. If you have already left us a review on one or more of those platforms, please pick a different platform to leave us a review. The more reviews we get, the better exposure we have across the internet, so the more people trust us and use us for events. If you have applied to work for us, obviously the more people who want to use us as their event medical provider, then the more work we will have for you guys to go around. Lastly, of course, I am going to leave this on. It is currently just gone 9 o'clock, so I'll leave this on till 9:10. If you would like to click on any of the links in the chat, review the chat, network with each other, that's absolutely fine. I'm going to mute myself, kill the video. The chat is all yours, and I will see you same time, same place next week. Good night, everybody.